Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show, Monster Mondays, each Monday afternoon. Both of those shows can be heard at filmseizure.com. I have a triple feature review for this episode, and I'll start now with The Menu, but then later I'll discuss Glass Onion, which is the sequel to Knives Out, and The Fabelmans from Steven Spielberg. The Menu might be one of the bigger surprise movies of the year. This dark comedy thriller from director Mark Mylod has been promoted for months. I think I first saw the original trailer for this movie maybe as far back as maybe the mid to late spring. Certainly by the early part of the summer, I was seeing the review. And there was a period in which I think I saw this trailer ahead most of the movies I saw at the time because they were either R-rated movies, independent movies, or horror movies. Whenever that happens, I get a little worried that maybe, just maybe, the movie has this neat look to it, has interesting characters, maybe some good one-liners for the trailer, but ultimately it isn't that good. That happens a lot with movies that get over-promoted. It's like it beats you into submission to just accept that you might as well see this movie that's been promoted ahead of every movie you saw at the theater. But what that early trailer provided was the sense that we would see this kind of modern take on maybe the most dangerous game. You have a master chef played by Ralph Fiennes who invites people to his restaurant only for it to turn into a hunt for a dish or something like that. Now, of course, we get glimpses of the high-class types who will be lured to this incredibly expensive dinner, and we might want to see them get chased down and killed or whatever. But then the second trailer came. The second trailer revealed a little bit more. This wasn't so much a hunt. While, yes, there is a scene in the movie that does feature a sort of hunt, but this is a little bit more calculated. There is an exact reason for every single person who is there at this dinner, except for one character. And that's really where the surprising bits of this movie come up. This is not a horror movie. It's barely a thriller. There are certainly tense scenes. Sure, but this is through and through a dark comedy. I would almost call it a social commentary fantasy. There is no real world in which this plot could ever take place. That's not the point of this movie. The more I thought about this movie, the more I realized that what is actually playing out in this movie is what most people who have ever worked a service job, be it at a restaurant or at a department store or in a customer service position. This is what they think whenever they encounter the worst customer or diner on any given day. Most adults who continue working in service jobs well into their middle age do it for one of three reasons. They either love that type of job, they are good at that type of job, or unfortunately it's the only job they feel qualified for. However, it's usually either the first or second reason, and that means that they have some sort of passion for being of service. They like cooking and feeding others. They like solving someone's problems, so on and so forth. But very often, there are those who are quote-unquote above that station, and they take advantage or belittle the service person, and it can drain the passion that that person has out of them to the point where that person working in that job may feel like they need to quit or try to find something else or whatever. And there are plenty of people who make the service worker feel all the good things, but then there are the ones who, that sting the most for the longest. And, those are the people who are rude or don't recognize the service person as being an actual human being and so forth. And that's kind of what The Menu is all about. Hawthorne is a high-class restaurant that only allows upward of 12 people, none of which may be seated alone, for a 6-course dinner that is prepared artfully by Ralph Fiennes, and the cost of each dinner is $1,250. You are taken to an island where all the ingredients are farmed or fished or slaughtered at. You spend the entire evening hearing the story of what's on the menu, and you are fed items that are different than any other restaurant. If you can only get 12 people in and they have to pay that much per dinner, What kind of people do you bring in? Well, you bring in the people who can afford that kind of meal. There are the casually rich present. There are the young dude bro types of people who only really care about saying that they spent that kind of money on a dinner. They don't really like the food. They don't really understand what they're eating. There's a washed up actor who still likes to live high on the hog. There's an uppity critic. And there's a true foodie who is almost like a groupie of the celebrity chef. And that celebrity chef leads an almost cult-like group of cooks and sous chefs who are utterly devoted to him. When you examine the employees of Hawthorne and connect it to the aloof diners, that's where you pick up on the commentary of the employees at this restaurant, that they've poured their lives and their souls into this experience. You have a celebrity chef who truly feels that he is, and probably does, create art with this storybook menu that is all part of a larger theme. These people who are doing what they are doing because, they're doing it because they love it. However, they have all kind of banded together because the people who they serve do not recognize their passion or their talents. They are simply gobbling down this expensive food, almost for clout. They don't really care to acknowledge the people working for them to basically prepare this meal. They're more than happy to exert their wants and desires instead of appreciating what's offered to them. And that kind of plays out, and what plays out during the course of this movie for each of these characters is a little bit of a wish fulfillment for those who have had to make themselves available for people who will never appreciate what those in the service sector is providing them. And it's a little bit of a difficult concept to explain, but if you've worked in the service sector, you can feel what our supposed villain is expressing when his plan starts to reveal itself. The characters in this movie are really pretty great. They're all quickly given exposition. There's one character later on that you learn much more about, and at first I thought this relationship to another character at this dinner was kind of superficial, but the more I think about it, the more I realize how important that it is known how these two people knew each other before coming to this island. Each character, except for one, ultimately reveals one thing about themselves that make them somewhat irredeemable. The one character you might think you're supposed to like, the most at least, kind of quickly reveals himself to be just as pompous as the rich dude bros who say lines like, do you know who we are, when they ask for something that's not on the menu. In fact, you don't get a choice. This is the type of dinner you go to, you get prepared. You don't have a choice of what you're eating there. You're given the food that the chef wants to make. Everyone plays their parts in this perfectly. And Anya Taylor-Joy is great as this kind of tough woman who is out of her element, but not hopelessly so. Nicholas Hoult is great as the foodie groupie who is the super fan of Ralph Fiennes. Hong Chow is this great assistant to Ralph Fiennes who is so rigid and stern that she can just simply say one word and it can almost send chills up your spine. But it's Ralph Fiennes who really owns this movie. You hang on every word he speaks, and he needs to have that presence because if his character doesn't work, the whole movie crashes and burns like a house of cards lit on fire with a flamethrower. So the menu is a fun, light thriller and a very funny dark comedy. So from a dark comedy about a killer chef, let's shift focus to a new film by a new up-and-coming filmmaker. I think his name is something like Steven Spielberg. Let me check on that. One moment. Yep. It is a guy who's goes by the name of Steven Spielberg. Of course, I'm joking around, but to be more serious now, from Spielberg comes a new coming-of-age, fairly autobiographical drama called The Fabelmans. I say it's kind of sort of autobiographical because this is at the very least clearly inspired by major events in his own life, and likely at least an idealized version of a young Spielberg growing up captivated by movies and making them. We're kind of in the era of what I like to call the post-Saving Private Ryan Spielberg. And what I mean by that is that prior to 1998, he made all the movies that we think of him making. Jaws, E.T., Close Encounters, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Jurassic Park. You get what I mean. However, once he kind of got into the 90s, he began shifting focus to more dramatic fare. Sure, he made another Indiana Jones, he made Minority Report and Ready Player One, but for the better part of the last 30 years, he's directed mostly dramas that have less spectacle and a lot more humanity. And I've liked most of his movies over the last 20 years that I've seen. Maybe two that get the most overlooked in this century, at least, are AI, the Kubrick project that he completed after the death of the all-time great, and then Minority Report. Those are back-to-back fantastic, true blue science fiction movies. Last year, I was kind of swept off my feet by his version of West Side Story, and it just missed my top 10 of last year. But The Fabelmans, on the other hand, that's likely going to make my top 10. This is such a pleasant and incredibly captivating melodrama of a mid-century Jewish family and a son who uses his dreams to tell an alternative reality that he can kind of reconcile with the world around him. The movie opens in 1952, which in what appears to be someplace east of the Mississippi River. And if this really is based on a lot of the facts of Spielberg's childhood, it is likely Cincinnati, Ohio. We meet the three elder members of the Fabelman family: Sammy, the eldest son and the eldest child of Paul Dano's Bert, and Michelle Williams' Mitzi. They're taking Sammy to his first movie, Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth. And he's particularly wowed by a scene in which a train crash occurs. And this leads him to asking for a train set for Hanukkah. And then when he's trying to recreate that scene, he wrecks the train, which kind of upsets Bert because Sammy seemingly doesn't care for the things that he says he loves. However, spotting a creativity streak in the young dreamer's actions, Mitzi decides to give Sammy the chance to use the family 8mm camera to film the train wreck so that he can watch that whenever he wants to see it, and that he can basically save his train set and appease his father. That kicks off Sammy's love of making movies. And some years later, Sammy is now an adolescent, and he, along with his parents and three younger sisters, moved to Arizona when his father gets a new position with computers and General Electric. Bert Fabelman is essentially an early computer scientist. With them comes family friend Benny, played by Seth Rogen, who's kind of an adjunct uncle for the family. In Phoenix, Sammy flourishes as a young filmmaker, working with his Boy Scout troop to make these epic movies. However, in one of the family home movies that he makes on this camping trip, a hidden secret is revealed which throws the future stability of the Fabelman family into serious doubt. Trouble comes when the family then relocates again to Northern California when Bert Fabelman gets another job opportunity, this time with IBM. Sammy loses his passion for making movies, and the family basically crumbles while Sam is discovering girls and dealing with bullies at school who throw something that he hadn't had to deal with up to this point into his life, and that's anti-Semitism. While it may seem like I described a lot of melodrama, which I will most definitely discuss here in just a moment, this movie does reveal something kind of under the surface. And the real heart of this movie comes from the fact that there is not really a perfect character in this entire movie. Dano's Bert is a little too pragmatic, and he's a little too focused on the realism of having a real job and building something that people will use, not very artistically minded. Williams' Mitzi lives too much in the clouds. Gabriel LaBelle, who's playing Sam, is also kind of selfish because he cares more about making his movies than he really does the rest of his family, at least on the surface. Deep down, he cares about that. But he's a little too much like his mother, and that family secret that starts to break the family apart, well, he helps hide it to the detriment of the family itself. While it's an awful lot for him to have revealed that as a teenager, it's kind of clear that he'd rather not let it create problems that might lead to him having more problems being able to make more movies. Also, there is the anti-Semitism part in the third act that is kind of interestingly played out in the eventual climax. There's no real definitive message given to the audience that clearly states that utterly bad anti-Semitism really is and how that's so detrimental to the society. It's not clearly stated. It's more the bullies are bad and they happen to be anti-Semitic. How Sam deals with that with this school project is kind of baffling, but it's also baffling to Sam. He resolves the issue by turning one of the bullies into a joke and another of the bullies into sort of a hero that forces that second bully into having to think about how he acts compares to the way people see him. It's an interesting statement to make, and it's kind of subtle, and it leads to this wonderful scene between LaBelle and Sam Reckner, who plays this bully, that shows some forgiveness while also forcing the antagonist to really think about who they really are versus what they should be. It's a really pretty good scene. And at first I wasn't sure about this part of the movie, but when it played out, it really is a very interesting scene because you do start to ask questions about why would anybody just kind of let somebody be so cruel to them and then make them into like this hero, this almost bronze god in this school project video. But it plays out very interestingly, and it really kind of shows the complexities of how these types of relationships and these types of things really do play out in real life. And that's really the key to this movie. It's so nice. It's not often that you get a movie that is just simply nice. You like the characters despite their faults. You laugh along with them as well as feel bad when things aren't great in the family, as if you were a member of the family. Then you have this general love of being creative and artistic on display. Sadly, this movie does also offer up with a brilliant scene featuring Judd Hirsch in one of those tiny, tiny parts that probably deserves an Oscar nomination. This kind of unfortunate truth that it is difficult to be devoted to your creativity while also being devoted to your emotional bonds with family, love, friends, etc. It's almost impossible to balance that. It's not something this movie hammers on, but we get a scene explaining it, and then we see it play out with that concept pushed to the back of our minds. So it's also this love letter to being creative and being almost dogged about expressing your creativity. But now for the melodramatic part that I talked about. This is kind of an old-fashioned drama. It's built around emotional moments and playful sequences. It feels like the types of dramas that ruled film in the 70s and 80s. It's kind of refreshing to see that kind of drama again. I know they've never really gone away, but this was the kind of drama that I really kind of grew up on and was happy to kind of see again in this sort of old-fashioned, straightforward style. Again, it's something that's kind of hard to explain, but it worked on me in every way that it was supposed to. Now, one final thing I do want to talk about. In the final minutes of this movie, Sammy is given a few minutes to talk to John Ford and to take advice from the greatest filmmaker alive at the time. This was like 1964, 65, something like that, when this takes place in the movie. But John Ford is played by David Lynch in a fantastic scene. He gives Sammy this tiny piece of advice. And when the movie ends with Sam practically walking on air after receiving this, we get this incredible moment where the camera takes that advice that's given from John Ford to make this excellent final shot that's just perfect. The Fabelmans is a fantastic movie, and it still proves that Spielberg has never really left the pinnacle that he's been on for almost 45 years now. So let's wrap things up with an anticipated sequel to 2019's surprise hit, Knives Out. And this movie is Glass Onion. Daniel Craig returns as a world-renowned greatest living detective in the world, Benoit Blanc. Also returning is writer-director Rian Johnson. And this time out, we have a movie that takes place specifically at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. That may seem a little peculiar, but it actually works its way in a couple of specific scenes and specific situations with the characters. That's really pretty great. But when we meet Benoit Blanc, he's in a bit of a rut. You see, when everything shuts down, he's not getting cases, and when he doesn't get cases, he gets a little crazy. And there's his first scene that you see him where he's talking to like some celebrity friends of his is kind of cute and pretty funny. How he's kind of describing himself going stir crazy. Now that might explain a little bit about exactly why he drives really into this scenario, and he really dives into it headlong. I'll try to talk a little bit about it without giving too much away, because there is an intricate plot that connects everyone. But here goes. Mega billionaire tech mogul Miles Braun, who's played by Edward Norton, always calls his closest friends to a reunion getaway each year. His closest friends consist of a scientist who works directly for him, played by Leslie Odom Jr., the governor of Connecticut, who's running for senator, played by Katherine Hahn, a supermodel, played by Kate Hudson, and a men's rights activist, played by Dave Bautista. Now, Bautista and Hudson's characters are also accompanied by Hudson's assistant, who is constantly putting out putting out the fires of her public blunders, played by Jessica Henwick, and Bautista's seemingly vapid girlfriend, played by Madeline Klein. The weekend is to basically play out what Edward Norton believes is an intricately planned out murder mystery. He's going to do a fun little make-believe murder, and the rest of the guests are meant to decide who did it and why. However, the weekend is thrown into chaos when ousted former business partner of Braun's, played by Janelle Monáe, shows up. Oh, and also Blanc is there. Now, I'm just going to say it right out. Glass Onion is not quite on the same level as Knives Out. That movie was one of those revelations. However, I was going to be happy going into this if Glass Onion was going to be half of what Knives Out was. But it's well more than half of what its predecessor is. This movie does crank up the more comedic quirks in the list of suspects. Bautista's MRA guy is a cartoonish buffoon. Hudson's fashionista is a complete idiot. Klein's influence is more than vapid. She's practically a non-person. And of course, there's Norton's tycoon. He's not a subtle, he's a not so subtle riff on an Elon Musk type who casually takes credit for game-changing technologies and ideas, and potentially leaves the real brains completely out in the cold, or in positions to basically take the legal or the more moral complications kind of onto themselves and take a hit to their names, while the rich guy is kind of protected by his money and power and his ability to use both to manipulate those who he kind of screws over. And what's great about Norton's character is that he plays this goof straight while also totally leaning on his kind of dull intelligence. He says words that sound right or interesting or make him out to be a smart guy, but he isn't using the right words, or he creates words that aren't real. It comes across fine in conversation, or at least it seems like he's using smart words, but he doesn't. He's fake. He is totally this guy who has more money than he could ever know what to do with. So he does lavish, stupid things with it because he's just kind of a dummy who had one brilliant idea and has the money now to make almost every other brilliant idea, successful, even if he has 100 brilliant failures to every one or two of those brilliant successes. What it all comes down to is that all but one of the characters with Blanc on this island are willing to sacrifice everything that is decent to essentially suckle off the teat of this incredibly wealthy and therefore very powerful person. You have this entire setting loaded with just awful people, and it leads to a lot of really funny moments and scenes. But really, the heart of this movie entirely belongs to two people. Johnson for wanting to deliver fun in this kind of whodunit style romp. And then, of course, Daniel Craig's always great performance as Blanc. He's pouring on this kind of dumb Southerner charm with acting a little aloof himself when he's tossed into these lavish surroundings with these types of characters. He's also a little elevated and more animated this time around due to that funk that he starts the movie off in. When he gets the chance to make a little dig on one of the characters who simply does not realize that he's putting them down, it's great. It's incredibly obvious to us, too. He even says it slowly so that anyone who hears what he's saying understands exactly what he's conveying. It's just great. Then when he finally gets his big moment to tear into his eventual target, the exasperation he emits is hilarious. It's a fantastic performance. It's, to think about it, to think about Daniel Craig being a great James Bond and now this great character, he's great. I mean, he's the type of actor that you almost want to see in every movie that he comes out with. And I definitely want to see a lot more of these Knives Out mysteries too. Glass Onion is just great. And yes, they do play the Beatles song that Johnson pretty much obviously lifted the title from. But a couple of final notes I have for all three of these very well made movies that I saw this week. This was a really great 8-day span that I spent going to these three movies. Each of these three movies are shot exceptionally well, with the menu both exhibiting a cold upper class feel while also making kitchens look like a joy to be in. The Fabelmans has this almost warm and loving glow to it. It's looking back fondly on a childhood in a simpler time spent dreaming about making movies while also focusing a lot at home. Glass Onion, of course, has this wonderful island setting that you just kind of want to spend a weekend at. The menu and Glass Onion both have ensemble casts that are incredibly well used and well directed and well cast. The Fabelmans took me back to dramas I remembered from an earlier time in my life. Like I said earlier, it's just a nice drama. I definitely recommend all three movies for three very different reasons. The Menu, if you want a thriller-esque kind of dark comedy. The Fabelmans for a warm and fuzzy coming-of-age drama. And Glass Onion if you like the whodunit style movies like Knives Out. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and Audible. You can also listen to the show on YouTube by subscribing there. I'll be back at some point. I'm not exactly sure when because while there are still a lot of movies that I do want to see in December, I'm not sure which ones I'll want to actually do a full episode on. So until I do another episode, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.